Hi, my name is Stan.
My name is Connie.
My name is Judy.
My name is Aileen, and I'm a caregiver to my mother.
And I care for my mother, Octavia.
And I'm a caregiver for my mother.
And I'm a caregiver to my husband, Art.
I'm a caregiver for my wife, Ann, who's 72 years old.
Basically, I've done everything for providing for both of them.
I take care of my mother on the weekends. I take her grocery shopping.
Not only household chores,
I provide her medical care, coordination, driving, errands.
choosing meals, making meals, cleaning up.
I find that I take care of anything that he can't take care of.
Sometimes I find balancing time a real challenge.
The difficult part for me is taking me into consideration.
Balancing her needs with the needs of my family, the needs of my marriage, and my own needs.
Staying calm, nice, and positive.
The real challenge is, of course, the distance and the moment you get that last phone call.
What I love most about taking care of her is knowing that we're providing a secure and comfortable home for her.
It's the time we spend together.
Is the adventure of finding out new things all the time to trying to help him stay out of pain.
My name is Ed. I'm a spouse and I'm a caregiver.
My name is Colette. I'm a daughter and a caregiver.
I'm a caregiver, and I'm a daughter.
And I'm a wife and a caregiver.
I'm a daughter and a caregiver.
I'm a son, a nephew, and a caregiver.
Hi, my name is Debra Day, and I help manage United Way Caregivers Coalition. While caring for a loved one has its special rewards, it's a very challenging job. It can be stressful, overwhelming, and sometimes lonely. Each caregiving situation is unique, but all caregivers share the need for information and support. And that's where the Caregivers Coalition comes in. We help caregivers receive the support they need to take care of their loved ones and to take care of themselves. Caregivers who lead healthy, productive lives will be better caregivers. The most important thing to remember is that as a caregiver, you're not alone.
So we want to be good caregivers, and the way you are a good caregiver is you get lots of ideas and people give you information, which is wonderful, but if you don't absorb the information or you don't know how to use it because of your own reactions, you won't be a good caregiver, which prompted me to think about what do we respond to, and we respond to demands and needs. So we'll start with the dictionary. The understanding a need versus a demand and a necessity versus a habit. A need is something that is required or is requisite, also defined as a necessity. A demand is to ask firmly or urgently, leaving no chance for refusal. So if you think about how you act towards the questions that come your way, you may be able to define whether you're responding to a need or a demand, but certainly a demand is quite a strenuous activity. A habit is a constant, often unconscious inclination. So I'll give you an example of what is probably a habit on my part. When I was in my teens, my father did this frequently. He'd say, "Rubala," my nickname, "go get me a tall glass of cold water." And like a good daughter, I would go get him a tall glass of cold water. My sister, 9 years younger, when she was about 11, he said, "Debra," also her nickname, "would you get me a tall glass of cold water?" And one day she turned to him, her sassy little self, and she said, "What happened? Your legs fall off?" So I thought, well, isn't that interesting? What was I responding to? I believe I was responding to a need and a want to please my father, but also a long-standing habit. So we all have stories of that sort. I work with a family, a father and two children. They're adult children. They all have their own families. And the problem is that he is 86, his wife is 85. and they are both, they're in pretty good shape, but the wife has had long-standing mental health issues for many, many years. And she basically rules from the bed. She stays in bed, and everybody has, for many, many years, responded to every one of her wants and needs. And especially the father, because he is a true inborn caregiver. And so they came to me because they said, Dad is not doing as well, and we want him to do well. We know that Mom is really not in great shape, and we don't know what's going to happen to her, but he's suffering at this point. Well, Dad doesn't know that he's suffering, actually, because he's so used to the role that he's been in. So we talked about, well, how do you get around this? Because everything in her life, and she does have rather significant mental illness, which was totally undiagnosed. So how are we going to handle this, we ask of each other. She stays in bed, she sleeps basically during the day, and her nighttime is her daytime. So now you know already that if that's the way her life is going, his life is totally disrupted as well. So that's among the things that they had to cope with. And then the other part of it was the husband was really getting tired. He really couldn't do some of the caregiving things that were being demanded of him. So we said, okay, let's do this. Let's bring in a caregiver. No. Well, after much discussion, he finally agreed to a caregiver. But it would be somebody who would come in just for him. And we said, okay, this is terrific. We now have a plan. There's going to be a caregiver coming in for Dad. And we ended the session, and the son turns to the sister and says, well, who's going to tell Mom? And I said, why would you tell Mom? And they looked, they were startled. After all, we tell the truth. We reveal all. Well, no, not if you want something else to happen. And so she wheeled around and she said to him, do you know for all these years we've all been enablers? And that was a profound moment for this family to open their eyes and see that they had been responding to the demands from the bed. That if what she wanted now, she would get it now. So when we look at demands and needs, I think it's extremely important to tap into your own reactions to things. So let's talk about the multidimensional caregiving role, which is you, and what you do, and how things develop incrementally, unpredictably and incrementally. Gail Sheehy wrote a book called Passages in Caregiving, and she writes this: help wanted. She took care of her husband for about 15 years. He had 2 rather significant illnesses ending in his death, but she did take care of him for a good long time. So she writes this ad: help wanted, untrained family member or friend to act as advocate, researcher, care manager, and emotional support for a parent or spouse, sibling or friend who has been diagnosed with a serious illness or chronic disability. Duties: make medical decisions, negotiate with insurance companies or Medicare, pay bills, legal work, personal care and entertainment in hospital and rehab. Aftercare at home: substitute for skilled nursing IV injections, oxygen, wound care, tube feeding are required. Long-term care: medication management, showering, toileting, lifting, transporting, etc. Hours: on demand. Pay: none. Does this sound familiar? I thought that was brilliant. So you all could tell me better than I can tell you what your roles are like for you and who you're taking care of, and what it's been like for you to move from one stage to another, and what your awareness is of those stages and how you feel about those stages. What I can tell you, and this is also a term that Gail Sheehy used, she called it a creeping crisis, which I thought was rather interesting. That you start off with one problem, and you just don't know where that's going to go. It resolves, and then it changes again, and it morphs into something different, and maybe somebody else in the family gets sick, or maybe you do, or maybe a child, or maybe a this, or maybe a that. So it takes a while for anyone who is in the caregiving role to really step back and understand that that is exactly what you are as a caregiver. There was I met a woman who said it wasn't until she came to a meeting of this sort that her friend turned to her and said, you know, you're a caregiver to your husband. And she said, no, I'm not. He's just a little bit sick. She said, no, you're a caregiver to your husband. And it took that moment for her to realize that that indeed had been her role. So we make assumptions about things, and we do have feelings about what we do. The other part of this is that the first responder, the first person who steps up or who is there, has to be there or is there because you live with the person, is also the person who takes control. And when you take control, everything is in your court. The problem with it being in your court is over time learning to let go of that. And so that also defines how you respond to crises or change, and how you respond to your role as a caregiver. Are you responding to a demand? Are you responding to a need? The other thing that I think is extremely important to understand is what life is like on the other side. I work primarily with people with dementia, so that's my frame of reference, is people whose lives are changing mentally as well as physically. What is it like for that person to go through changes and to be aware of it? Obviously, when there's a physiological change, you know that your things are happening and that they're different, and that also is incremental, and that also plays a toll on the person with the illness. R.D. Laing was a Scottish psychiatrist who wrote extensively on mental illness. He was also a poet. And I'm going to read some excerpts of a poem that he wrote. It's a little unfair to read excerpts of poetry, but he's not here. And the reason I write this is because I think it captures the mind of a person with dementia. There's something I don't know that I'm supposed to know. I don't know what it is I don't know, and yet I know I'm supposed to know, and I feel I look stupid. Therefore, I pretend to know everything. I feel you know what I'm supposed to know, but you can't tell me what it is, because you know that I don't know what it is. So you will have to tell me everything. Does that sound familiar? Yes. Right. Where was I? When was I? So from the perspective of the people that we're caring for, among the things that gets sort of washed away is who that person was. And in the support groups that I run, people often talk about my husband who did such and such when he was working, or did you know that he played the guitar, or that he was a painter. My wife was a singer and a dancer. And it takes a while to remember, it takes time and a while to remember who that person was. We often forget because you begin to focus on the person in their new and different status. So how you respond to that person becomes incredibly important. It's not easy to remember a person who is so diminished, who speaks in word salad, but it's incumbent upon us to think about who was this person? What was it about that person that I liked, that I wanted to be with him or her to begin with? Or who was my mother, or who was my father? So a person with an illness like dementia loses autonomy, and they certainly react to the loss of independence and the increased dependency on help from others, and especially when it's preemptive. So we might say, well, she shouldn't do that in the kitchen anymore. It's dangerous for her. But we don't know if it is dangerous or not. That's an assumption that we make because we see that something looks unsafe. There was a video of a series of videos about a woman named Grace that the Alzheimer's Association had. I used to use it for training. And in one section of it, and she would get very agitated, but to her great credit, she was still very nimble. And in one section, she's cutting a tomato, and training aides, and they would look and I'd ask them, should she be cutting the tomato? Half would say yes, and half would say no. So I pointed out to them how she was cutting the tomato. She cut it this way, then she turned it on its top, and she cut this way, which really is a pretty sophisticated way of cutting. She was not going to hurt herself. So the people in the room who understood that she had that ability then knew that as caregivers, had that been their responsibility, had she been their responsibility, they could have backed off and just stood by and watched her. So things like that are subtle, aren't they? Well, no, you have to take the knobs off the stove, and you can't let them go outside in the backyard because you don't know what they'll do. Well, like as you did when you were raising children, or if you didn't have children, what you observe in life, you observe. How do they do it? How well do they do it? Again, something that we often forget. We also find ourselves talking about people when they're standing right there. So when I go to a doctor's office with a client as a geriatric care manager, I always address the doctor and have the doctor address the client, even if I know the client doesn't understand what he or she is saying. Because they do understand something. They understand that all eyes are turned away from them. So what is that like? And when you get reaction from the person that you're caring for, you're getting a reaction from a person who's feeling quite diminished. And they also try to retain control, which is very hard because we take control away. So I have this idea of reaching in and reaching out, which is the premise of the whole talk really in part. And that is when you know what you're doing, if you're reacting to a demand or you're reacting to a need, you begin to develop a way of seeing the work that you're doing differently. Because in order to do it, you have to understand a little bit about yourself. So what you need to understand about yourself is that you have reactions. You don't have to go to a psychotherapist, although I advocate for that. It would be helpful to go to a support group, which I do advocate, because you get to hear other people's issues and problems and you begin to put pictures together. And pictures is what it's about. So in order to reach in and to reach out, it takes a little self-reflection. When my son was in his teens, he is now a strapping young man of almost 29, I was quite angry with him, and I wagged my finger in his face, which I was known to do, and I said, I want you to go someplace and I want you to think about why you do the things you do. And about 15 years later, about 10 years later, he reminded me of that, and he said, you know, I sometimes do that. I go someplace and I think about why I'm doing what I'm doing. So I offer to you my son's line, or that is that he remembered, it was my line, he remembered it, and reflect on what is the reaction that you're having. Is it because you are angry at the person, angry at the situation? Are you feeling pushed? Are you feeling pulled? Are you responding, unlike my sister who said, what, your legs fell off? I needed to please this man. And by the way, he walked into the kitchen with his shoulders shaking in laughter and saying, would your legs fall off? Did your legs fall off? Because he realized how funny it was. My reaction was an old one. I was just being that good little girl. And we can't always be a good little girl. We can't be a good little boy. We can't be a good little anything when the stress is so tight. So we look for approval. Oftentimes we feel that we just can't do enough. We feel that we have to prove that we're doing the right thing, which sort of brings me back to the idea of the first responder. That's the person who may be the one to hold on to things and says, nobody will help me. Well, who did you ask? And how did you ask? And are you aware that you're holding on to more than you need to hold on to? There are some families in which there's no choice. There's only one person. But there is community. So we have to remember that there is community to rely on and to call upon. When you understand your reactions, you can become a better caregiver. And part of that is becoming knowledgeable about the illness and really thinking in advance of what might come down the road. People get surprised for two reasons. One is they just don't know enough about the illness that they're dealing with. And everything becomes a hands up. Oh my God, I didn't know. Oh my God, I didn't know. Or they see a good day and they say, it's okay, everything's fine. We'll be okay. If you don't know what's ahead, you really can't plan for your daily life. And what that means to you, to all of us, is you don't know whether you're going to end up in the hospital. I have taken people to hospitals on a number of occasions, ruining an entirely fine week for me, but that's what I had to do, which meant I had to rejigger this and rejigger that and make sure I had all my paperwork. I've run to hospitals with release forms so that the hospital knows who I am. That's one thing. But then and that's unexpected. Then nobody can predict that. But then you have things like, you know that there's a progression to an illness. If you don't know what the progression is, if you don't have a sense of it, you will never be able to respond adequately to it. So it isn't that you need to become the expert on every illness, but if you have some idea of how it progresses, that arms you to know what you will need to do in the future. Not the least of which are things like planning. You need to have financial planning, you need to have physical planning, you need to have the right doctors, you need to know what the community has to offer you. All of those things are important, and here you are as the caregiver, and you are so resentful because you are working, you're taking care of your children, and now you're being called upon to make a plan. And the plan isn't an action plan that you have to carry through on that given day. It's an idea so that you don't get caught by surprise. That's one of the hardest things. I do that for families in my role as a care manager all the time. What do you have? What do you need? What are the resources? What do I need to do to help you to get what you need? And without a care manager, you have family, you have friends, you have community. So for example, we have the three sisters. The dad was early stage dementia, young man, and they were frantic. He had to leave his apartment, the lease was running out, and he, for whatever reason, which I never understood, he couldn't stay in this apartment. And the three sisters decided he would be better off in a 55-plus community, a little bit away from where he had been living, but it would be a good, safe place for him. So they said, Dad, this is what we're doing, and they moved him. And he, of course, had not a clue what they were doing. He was still reasonably competent, but he didn't quite get why he had to move to some place that he didn't know. So he goes because he's a good dad, and he thought his daughters were helping him, and he was very happy and grateful for their help. Not too long after he moved in, he realized he had no idea where the shopping was. How was he going to get to a grocery store? How was he going to negotiate the streets that he'd never been on? So he drives, and he finds his way. And then when he comes back to the place, none of it looks familiar. And so he starts parking in random places. And then the call from the management, your dad can't have, he can't have a place because you're going to have to get rid of the car for him because he doesn't know what he's doing. He's making people angry. So the daughters flutter and they go, okay, and they take the car away. So now we have a dad who is living in a strange town, doesn't know anybody. His friends are 3 towns over or 4 towns over. Now he doesn't have a car, so he can't get there. He has no idea geographically where he is. And on top of that, they decide to put an aide in the home. And they get very upset because he kicks the aide out. Well, what would you do? So these 3 daughters, without thinking, did 3 whammies in one shot. Within 2 months, this man had been stripped of his dignity, of his ability to move around, his ability to get near friends, even his ability to just do basic shopping. So of course they started to bring things in, which brings me back to the other point of you start taking things away from people without realizing what you're doing. So his reaction was he stopped talking to them. He would talk to the grandkids, but he wouldn't talk to his daughters for quite a while. I think eventually they found some solution, but I don't even know what it was. So the subtext of our daily life is knowing that none of this will get better. It will progress. And I say the subtext because we don't talk about what it feels like at the deepest level possible to know that the person that you're caring for is getting sicker and sicker. And the terms for that for you or for any caregiver is anticipatory grief. You begin to feel the sense of loss fairly early on. Even if things are okay, you know that down the road things won't be okay. So that's your subtext. And we don't pay attention to it much because life is good, it's moving along, things are steady. But in fact, it's there. And it lives with you at all times. The other one is, the other term for that, which I also like, is ambiguous loss. Because it is ambiguous. You don't know what you're losing. Well, actually, you do know what you're losing. You're losing the person that you knew in the form that you knew him or her. So a woman named Sylvia Borstein, who is a spiritual person who also a Buddhist, she wrote a book called That's Funny You Don't Look Buddhist. And she said, she said, and she talks about children, but it occurs to me that this is for adults as well. The best way to nurture children's inner lives is by taking care of our own inner selves for their sake. So what you do for yourself will be given out to the person that you're caring for. So the same is true for you as caregivers. When you reach in and you can acknowledge that you're angry, well, we all say, well, we're angry, but what is it about that makes you angry? I'll give you one little story here. I went to California recently because my aunt, my 92-year-old aunt, was moving into an independent living. She is not somebody who would live in an independent living. But here she was, having to concede that, in fact, her memory was not as good as she thinks it was. And she was a pretty sharp woman in her day, and I was very close to her. And so my cousin and I were talking, and they had this mother-daughter thing going that's gone on for many years. And I said, you want me to come out? That's touchy, because I'm the professional, and that's my cousin, and that's her mother. She jumped on it. I was able to do for my aunt what she couldn't do, which leads me to the idea that you always look for people who can help. So when my aunt insisted that no, that 50-year-old recliner was staying in that apartment, that new apartment, even though it was banging into things and you couldn't really walk around it and you had to crawl out of bed this way because it's sitting there. But when I slept in it that night and I woke up the next morning and she said, how was it? I said, it was horrible. She said, but if I have guests over, they can sleep there. I said, they'll never be able to do it. I could barely pull it back into a sleeping position. How will an 80-year-old do that? So she conceded with me to get rid of it, which she would not have done with her daughter. I also was able to help her unpack things, which she would never have done with her daughter. So we worked hand in hand. And I spoke to my cousin recently. She said, you'll be so proud of me. I'm not reacting as much. I said, good, because you love that woman. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to greet the stranger. Greeting the stranger, I mentioned this to a colleague of mine, a psychologist, and he said, it sounds like Capper's syndrome, which is when a person no longer appears or seems like the person that you know, and they look to you as though they're an imposter. So that's a syndrome that I didn't know about. But I thought about how often we hear people with dementia say, I don't know where I am. I have a client who says, I don't know where I am. This isn't my house. So it's no longer familiar. But we also look at the people that we care for, especially when it comes to dementia, and we say the same thing. So I want to read to you a son's observation. This is somebody that I know locally. The other day I was sitting and doing some paperwork. My mother was out, and she expected him to get in the shower and get prepped, which is about a 2-hour process, but he's still doing it himself. He came over to me completely naked and holding the cheat sheet, asking me to confirm its various directions for him. I read it to him, and he said, why do I have to take a shower? I noted, so you could start the day. He said, but I'm scared. So I asked him if he could recall any truly horrifying stories in the last 44 years of using the same shower, and he couldn't. He then asked me again why he should take a shower. I told him, and he asked why it made a difference. I said, you'll feel better. And he said, and how are you sure I will feel better? I just looked at him because I truly believe it, the son said, and tapped his chest with his hand to make the sincere point. That seemed to work, and he went off and took a shower. I asked myself, who is this guy, and where had my father gone, really? So we have to be aware that the people that we care for a variety of reasons and a variety of ways, not only change, but do seem strange. And what's also strange is that there's a loss. You are losing that person. And even if you had a horrible relationship, every once in a while you want to get back in the fray and have one of those good arguments. And now you can't. Well, you could, but I don't know that you'd get the good feedback that you would want. So the next thing is, and this this is the genesis of this whole discussion, is from Judy. I had said to her, she gave you want to tell it? No. Okay. So there was some tumult in the house, and her husband once again was demanding, can you get this for me? So I'm making this up. This is not literal. And so she ran to get it, and she said, and it just frustrates me. I don't know why I have to keep doing that. Why? And I said, well, you listen too closely. So what does it mean when you listen too closely? It means that everything that person says is gospel? I don't think so. Everything that person says is right? Every demand has to be met? Not necessarily. I say take your time, listen again, wait for it to happen again, listen for a crash. Maybe what you're listening for is just an automatic reaction to something that you absolutely think is necessary, a demand, versus a need. So I think Judy decided that it was okay for her to say to him, why don't you get it yourself? And lo and behold, he got up and he went and he got it himself. And by the way, not for nothing, it's empowering when people are pushed a little bit. In my 89-year-old, I say to her, what are you going to do today? You're going to do the dishes? You're going to vacuum? Now, sometimes she says, well, I don't have to do any of those things. Other times she says, yes, I think I'm going to do the dishes today. And indeed, she makes herself useful by doing the dishes. And that is her home, and that is exactly what she should be doing, because this woman knows how to wash a dish. And she does a very nice job of it. So to take that away doesn't make a lot of sense. So I work with her aide and say, no, step back, let her do it. Don't take those things away from her. Two reasons for that with dementia. One is there's a sense of purpose. The other, it's a diversion. And the diversion is when she says, I'm not in my own home, ask her to vacuum the floor. Maybe just tell her you need some help. And she loves vacuuming. So don't listen too closely is an important idea, that you modulate how you respond to things, and you weigh and balance what is necessary, what isn't, what is helpful to you and what is helpful to the person you're caring for. And how often do we say, it's just easier for me to do it? Well, in this case, it may not be easier. It may be more detrimental than you're aware at the time. You'll eventually catch on when things change and you say, why did I do that? So the other part of it is, there's one little, I met with somebody this morning, and her story was, she takes care of her mother who's in another state, and she travels to see her pretty frequently. And her mother is a very aggressive person, and she is losing ground mentally very rapidly. And her way of handling that is to become very angry with her daughter. And up until recently, and her daughter would just run in all the time. So of course I said to her, you're listening too closely. It's my mantra. And the other thing was, her mother would say to her, I'm the mother. You listen to me. And I said, well, maybe you could approach her differently. Maybe you could approach her with, we're adults now, and I'm here to help you. And she said this morning, do you know that since she had said that to her mother has never repeated that. So interesting how when you think about something and you think it through to its logical conclusion, you think, well, yeah, because what's the reaction to, I'm your mother? Well, I'm an adult too. Well, not if you say it that way. But if you bond and say, we're doing this together, you need help and I'm here to help you, let's do this together, there's a different tone. And it took her a little bit of time to step back from that. So the last piece is expect the unexpected. Never assume that one day's good day is the next day's good day, because the next day could be horrible. And it could be a physical issue, it could be a mental issue, it could be any number of things that set you back or set the person back. But your expectation, and part of the expectation is, I do such a good job, my mother did so well today. Well, and then came the next day, not so good. Does that make you bad? No, the progression of the illness is unpredictable. And unless you accept that there is no way to anticipate unexpected things, you will always sit with the idea that if I'm a good girl, if I'm a good person, this will all go my way. This will happen. This will really, look at this, there's a turnaround. Things are going to be a lot better. So I hearken back to Sylvia Borstein, the Buddhist, and she makes an analogy to a GPS system. And she says, basically what we always have to do is recalculate. So I leave you with that thought. Learn to recalculate. The question was, are there do other people have the experience of I'm going to say a particular time of day, because for some it's morning, some it's afternoon, some it's evening, when you feel sharper or when you lose your patience or lose your ability to do caregiving. So I don't know what the answer to that is. I think that everybody fatigues, and whether it's morning, noon, or night, at some point that's going to happen. The question is, what do you do about it? And, you know, if you are able to communicate with your loved one and able to say, let's just take a rest for a little bit, or what do you need now that I can get you before I sit down to take a rest? And so that you prepare so that you can take a rest. And in fact, I worked with someone whose husband was very ill, and she had no sooner sat down to have her dinner when he would call from the other room, "Can you get me?" So we worked on that, and she ended up saying to him exactly what I said. What do you need before I sit down so that I can have my dinner? Because I'm going to sit down and have my dinner. So there's a key there. And he understood what that was about. And he accommodated that. It took him a little bit of a while, but he eventually accommodated that. So I really think it's being honest and saying, I need to sit down for a few minutes. Can I get that for you later? And there's nothing like delayed gratification. That works really well. If you respond immediately, you're setting up a situation where you might not, unless you have to, you might not want to set that situation up. If you set it up so that you respond immediately, how do you reverse that? If you're dealing with somebody with dementia, that's a little bit more difficult. If you're dealing with someone with a physical illness, you can do in both instances the delay tactic. I can do it, but I'll do it in a couple minutes. I'm in the middle of doing something. I need to finish what I'm doing. I'll do it in a couple minutes. If you're talking to someone who is mentally competent, then you just say, you know, I think I've been hand-holding you a little bit too much. So the question was, when someone believes, I worked in an adult day center, and we had a lot of people with different professions, but nurses were amongst them. So the question, and what we did, was this one woman in particular would come in, and she was the nurse, and we gave her a chart, and she would go in and she would do whatever she did with that chart, and at the end of the day, before she went home, she'd bring the chart back, and good job, thank you very much. You don't take away a person's memories or their dignity. So the question of, do you stop a person from believing that they have meaningful activity? No. Why? It's not as though he's going out into the street as a construction worker and trying to bang a hole in the cement. He is doing what he knows to do. You could also tell him you're doing direct deposit. But, you know, it's also the reversal of memory. People are going back in time. So if you take that away, you take away identity, and you create confusion. Yeah. So what you want to do is to maintain the integrity of a person. Your husband went to a support group for people who had heart, whatever the issue was, and he learned that, which is the entire purpose of a support group, which is you bond around commonalities. Differences as well, but mainly commonalities. And you learn, which is I think, we're all very private people. We don't always like to well, except me, I say anything to anybody, but but we like our privacy. And that works for a good long time, especially when you're a vibrant person in a working world and you know who you are and you're valued and you're a contributor. And the minute that stops, my neighbor across the street just had a defibrillator put in. And he sat there and he said, that's the best thing I could have done. He's a young guy. He's not even, I think he's just about 60. The best thing I could have done. I waited 15 years to do it, but now I'm happy. I feel good. So for 15 years, he lived with a sense of dread and never talked about it. He had had a heart attack 15 years ago, and only now did the defibrillator. So I think when you walk into a room of people whose problems are like yours, you immediately are disabused of the notion that you're the only one. And that's true of caregivers. There are stories for stories. And it's not a one-upmanship, but it is a lesson in life that what you have is shared by somebody else someplace. And the quicker you're able to understand that, the quicker you're able to figure out, well, now what do I do?